Okay, let's make sure this is all working and all sounding good. And once it's all sounding good, we will get going, get a move on. I think we're sounding good. I think everything is okay. That's awesome. Okay, we're just going to share this on Twitter and then we're going to get the show on the ROAD, and that will be that. So thank you all for your patience as we get this up and running. It's awesome to be back. I'm so happy to be here. Just about there. Almost there. Okie dokie. I think we are appropriately posted on X, and so that means it's time for the show to get on the road. Thank you so much for watching, liking, listening, coming out to chat. My name is Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and for the purpose of this podcast, I'm just Patrick. I'm just here to hang out. So, welcome to UnShrink Me. This is a weekly podcast that is focused on mental health, psychiatry, clinical psychology, mental health, etc., related services, techniques, ideas. The purpose of this podcast, just so everybody knows at the beginning of this, is not to provide specific mental health related advice. This is not Frasier or something like that. The purpose of this podcast is not to tell you what works and what doesn't work necessarily, because that's not something I can always say. Most people's mental health is very contextual and complicated. But the purpose of this podcast is to talk about trendy things that are currently being discussed, typically on Twitter, etc., but also just generally in the ethos, in the zeitgeist, because a lot of things that are out there that people might perhaps think is valid or real or possible actually is misleading them. It's giving them false expectations, false hope, which I think is not loving, or it's false pessimism, which is even more not loving. So my job, my goal with this podcast, just so everyone knows, is to be appropriately skeptical and critical of the various types of things, if that makes sense, that are being talked about on a weekly, monthly basis online that are trendy in therapy land, the world's worst theme park. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. If you find something helpful, interesting, or even funny today, please like, share, and subscribe. I got my friend Willow back there who's going to help me out with this. And as always, this podcast is not NOT sponsored by Celsius, but this shit's great and I love it. Amazing. So we have so much to talk about. I missed last week because I was out socializing with one of my psychologist friends and all these things, and it was just a very busy week, but so much to talk about today. Today is going to be a very busy podcast. So many things I missed out on, so much to talk about. As always, if you're here watching and listening, you can please chat, join us, ask questions, share an opinion, and I will try to respond to it and make sure I'm doing something to interact with you in a reasonably socially appropriate way. So we're going to talk today about context and community a great deal, because one of the big secrets and one of the big problems in mental health treatment and therapy land, again, the world's worst theme park, is that we tend to think of this as just individual stuff. You're an individual with depression and it's your problem that you have to deal with. And although that's kind of sort of true, it's also missing all sorts of stuff. So I'd like to correct that mistaken assumption. I'd also like to talk about niceness, professional clinical niceness. I'd also like to talk a little bit today about moralizing in therapy. And so with those three topics, I think we can kind of have a lot of fun. So let's start today first with the topic of professional niceness. And I'm just going to retweet something that I saw earlier today that prompted this thought. so that we can all be on the same page. So earlier today, a person named Grant Brenner, who I think I've been interacting with for quite some time. Grant is a psychiatrist, I believe, and psychotherapist. His handle is at Grant H. Brenner, BRNNERMD, on Twitter. And this is what he said about 9 years earlier today. So, or 9 hours, excuse me, not 9 years. That would be interesting if it was 9 years ago, but equally relevant back then too. So, what we have is, expecting someone, these are his exact words in his post from 9 hours earlier, expecting someone to act, in quotes, nice all the time, or at least the pretense thereof, because they are in a caregiving profession, is a form of coercion, which I see deployed on this platform, Twitter, all the time. And people often respond, as he said, in quotes, "I feel sorry for your patients." So I've actually had this levied at me a number of times in the years that I've been on Twitter. And to be fair, I understand why people say things like this. It's not strange to me or weird to me that people would say, "I feel sorry for your patients." And so let me just kind of walk this out a little more than whatever Grant said or even Grant implied, because I don't know specifically necessarily what he was implying, but I can kind of extrapolate a little bit. So the first sentence is expecting someone to act nice all the time, or at least the pretense of being nice, because they are in a caregiving profession is a form of coercion. So let's talk about this. So when medical professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, etc., like myself, are online, therapists of whatever background, whatever degree, there is some expectation that we represent the profession. In fact, just to make this, a little culture war related, there's our buddy Jordan Peterson, who probably is the most famous mental health professional online for the last 10 years. And Jordan got into all sorts of online arguments with people of the, the left-wing variety politically or whatever. A lot of people just hated the guy for, various reasons. And so he was not nice. He was not nice about Ellen Page. He was not nice about people who had a political disagreement with him. He used very stark language. And I bring him up as an example, not because I necessarily agree with him or disagree with him, but because he's an example of what Grant here is talking about. And people had all of these reactions to Jordan when he wasn't nice, right? When he had a different opinion, when he wasn't socially pleasant, right? Or politically correct. Hoorah, Phil. Glad you're here. Thanks for commenting. So, I want to talk about Jordan's example, but also just generalize to any mental health professional. So something that everyone needs to understand, I think, this is for the consumers of mental health services across the globe, for anyone who hears this. What all of you need to understand is that your mental health professional is not especially healthy. I'm going to say that again in the simplest possible terms. Your mental health professional is a regular person, in case you didn't know that. I know it's sometimes the case that people idealize or would like to idealize their mental health provider, especially if they have a fancier degree, like an MD, a PhD, PsyD, whatever. So I get that when you're called doctor, there's an implication that you're especially professional, or especially put together, or especially healthy, or especially smart, or something like that. There's a connotation, there's an idealized connotation to being doctor. Like, I'm Dr. Lockwood, which must imply that I'm either particularly smart, particularly healthy, particularly put together, self-aware, something like that. However, the problem that everyone faces, literally, is that your mental health provider of whatever degree, whatever gender, whatever age, whatever background, whatever political belief system, whatever, we're all regular people. You need to understand that. And if you don't understand that, which might be kind of hard because, for instance, some of you might be receiving mental health services right now from someone you really like or that you really respect, which is great. And I'm super happy if that's the case. If you have a therapist you really like, or that you respect a great deal, I'm very happy to hear that. And I'm glad that that's the case, because sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes your therapist is an idiot. Sometimes your psychiatrist is a cold-hearted retard. And that happens. They just don't know anything. They have terrible bedside manner. They don't understand people. Whatever. That happens. And so we're regular people. We are regular people with an irregular degree, if that makes sense. We are people for various reasons that I talk about online on a regular basis that some of my colleagues don't agree with or like. We are a special kind of regular people, if that makes sense, not to be too contradictory. And so the expectation that mental health professionals who, quote unquote, help people or help people heal or whatever, because of that, we have to be nice online, is absurd. It's absurd for two reasons. Number one, which I've already stated, we're regular people. And because we're regular people, we don't have perfectly nice personas or something like that. That's thing number one. But thing number two, which is even more important, which is, I think, harder for people to understand, is that it's actually a special type of person that becomes a mental health provider, a mental health care provider. I've been arguing with Ed Perrin about this, I think, for the last week. And I've also been talking to Dr. Jonathan Shedler as well about this as well. So Dr. Perrin and Dr. Shedler on Twitter for the past week. So feel free to search out those posts if you want. But the idea that people come into mental health work because they're healthy or put together is silly. It's usually the exact opposite. What I've been saying basically is that there's a specific type of unmet needs or even mental ill health that pushes you towards clinical psychology, psychiatry, etc. And because of those specific personality differences, unmet needs, and mental health problems, there's this perfect combination of those things for people. Whatever it is, it's different for each person. But those three categories of things, the particular mixture, to be special, to feel powerful, to know a lot of things, to have unlimited positive or negative or whatever attention from a patient, right? Like those things are there in each clinician. And so because that appears to be true, at least from what I can tell, in my convenient sample of life for the last 15 years in the industry, I think that the expectation should be the exact opposite for clinicians online. I would argue that clinicians are probably going to be some of the least nice people online. Now, to be fair, plenty of clinicians online are perfectly nice. They're perfectly thoughtful, caring, funny, loving people. And so there's nothing, quote unquote, wrong with your therapist if they're sometimes an asshole online, or if they're sometimes mean, or they're a dick, or they make bad jokes or cruel jokes or whatever. Whatever the reason is, your therapist is not under any special pressure to be quote unquote nice online because we are not acting. Our ethics code does not transfer to social media, right? If we are being our regular selves, if I'm just like Patrick Lockwood on Twitter, for instance, which I am, I'm a Lobha Patrick, which means non-attached Patrick on Twitter. I'm not acting as Dr. Lockwood on Twitter. I'm acting as Patrick, me, the regular person. Now, I can't just like take off the jacket, so to speak, and be not Dr. Lockwood. I always have that connotation. I always stink of Dr. Lockwood online. But the truth of the matter is I'm also allowed to be a regular person. There's this inherent duality that every mental health professional, every healthcare provider unfortunately carries everywhere they go, which is they're always a regular person and they're also unfortunately always a professional. But to be clear about our ethics code, what it says, we're not acting in our professional role. No healthcare provider should be acting in their professional role on social media, on personal social media. Does that make sense to everyone? I hope it does, because although we can't take off the jacket, so to speak, we are technically acting as our regular selves. Regular person Patrick is on Twitter. not Dr. Lockwood. Even though I'll always seem and smell like Dr. Lockwood, it's kind of stinky. But like, I'm always just me, even though I always have the aura of Dr. Lockwood. Because people don't just magically forget that you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a therapist. It's just impossible to do for most people. So the important thing is that your clinician is allowed to be a regular person. And they're allowed to just act in a non-professional role on social media in particular, just so everyone's clear. In fact, it's probably best practices to just be a regular person on social media and not a professional. Like, I'm explicitly currently using my YouTube channel, and I title this podcast UnShrink Me, and I'm trying to walk both lines, kind of personal and professional. But the truth is, this is quasi-professional because I'm trying to kind of like psychoeducate to some degree. I'm trying to give people a sense of like what could be true. Could be true, right? And so my YouTube channel currently serves the purpose, ethically speaking, of like psychoeducation. Even though I'm not professing to have a professional relationship with you, the viewer or listener of this podcast, because I can't. It's impossible literally to have a professional relationship with you as a podcaster who's creating this content. I can like sort of have a relationship if you comment and chat and stuff, but the truth of the matter is I'm mostly creating what's called asynchronous content, where I create something, I put it out, and people respond to it later. So not really even having a relationship, right? So anyways, we are under no obligation to be nice. We should obviously live our principles. I encourage every human being that I meet professionally and personally to live their principles, because I think when we live a principled life, we live the best possible life. But that doesn't mean we're perfect. And also, some of the stuff that people say online, that professionals say online, there's all sorts of context and nuance and tone of voice that you don't even understand, for instance, because it's the written word. It's not the spoken word. You can't hear things. You can't see faces. You can't understand tone of voice. You can't know the context of what was said. So niceness is impossible to really even interpret in many cases online, unless it's a video clip. And even then, it can be taken out of context. So niceness. If your therapist is especially nice online, I would worry about them. They're probably fake. Because most therapists are not super healthy people, number one. But number two, there's no expectation that you're not a regular person. Now, should you be a dick? Should you be an asshole? Or should you be a pussy? And that Team America, trifecta version of it? No, you shouldn't be any of those three things. I think all of us should try to live a principled life and be as close to the best version of ourselves as possible. But sometimes therapists are dicks. Just to be all Team America about it. Sometimes therapists are dicks online. Sometimes therapists are assholes, and sometimes they're pussies. And that's okay. And that has nothing to do with you, the patient who happens to run across them online, or the public who runs across them online. Your therapists are regular people. And expecting them to not be regular people is actually a you problem. Because we are not acting in our role as professionals on Twitter, on Instagram, or most of the time on YouTube, right? And hopefully, if you're an ethical clinician, you will state in crystal clear terms when you are acting in your role and when you are not acting in your role. Now, sometimes it's super gray. So for instance, this podcast, as I said earlier, is kind of gray because I am technically just Patrick, because I can't really have a professional relationship with you, but I can't just not be Dr. Lockwood, unfortunately. And so because of that, it is kind of both, unfortunately. And I do risk, someone taking something I say out of context or having a bad reaction to something because I said the word pussy earlier or whatever. And that's a risk I have to carry. And that's reality. And that's the world we live in. It's a litigious world and all this stuff. But the truth of the matter is the average person gets it. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm not trying to be your therapist right now. I'm just trying to share my opinions. And I'm trying to share opinions that might be helpful to people so they can have a better relationship with their mental health care provider. That's all I'm really trying to do. Genuinely. So thank you, Grant, for the grist for the mill for this first part of the discussion. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Therapists do not have to be nice online, or ever, by the way. Therapists should be living according to their ethics and their values. And that's that. So thank you, Grant. Okie dokie. All right, let's talk about Nick Tabor, everybody. I'm going to repost this real quick. So part 2 of today's podcast is talking about context, community, and mental health. The 2 C's, context and community. So let me repost this real quick, and then I will start reading word for word what he said. Okie dokie. So Nick Tabor, who I've spoken about before, his handle is at NICKTABER. He posted this on October 18th, so about a week ago. So here's what he said on October 18th. In quote, "The psychiatrists and mental health professionals themselves also tend to believe in the fundamental goodness of these environments, like most families, like the ways that we tend to raise children, and our basic modern schooling methodology, ... They're not asking very deep probing questions about the nature of your average family or the school system. No, they tend to just kind of defer to whoever's in charge of those systems and then basically give them what they want with regard to managing children." So Nick's post is one that I'm going to read in context with a separate post. So I hope you all heard that. So Nick's post is specifically about psychiatrists and mental health professionals giving into school systems, family systems, and how kids are mistreated by school systems, pathologized by school systems and family systems, ADHD, learning disabilities, and the like. So I'm going to add a second post at the same exact time. Now this might seem unrelated, but I promise you I will tie them both together. So this next one is from Justin Garson, who I've spoken about, I think, 10 or so podcasts so far. So let me post this right now. On October 14th, he said this. So he said, 2 weeks ago, I visited a therapeutic community in Vermont called Inner Fire, INNERFIRE. It's a refuge for people with serious mental illness, an alternative to hospitalization and psychiatric drugs. People spend their days gardening, eating nourishing food, and engaging in various forms of therapy in a serene environment and a safe, supportive community. On arriving, you have no idea who the clients are and who the counselors are. Similar homes exist in Vermont, like Soteria, but they struggle with funding and legitimacy, despite studies suggesting they offer care comparable or superior to the status quo. I'm writing a longer essay now, but visiting Inner Fire solidified my conviction. Alternatives to hospitals and drugs do exist. We need to be aware of them and invest in them. So first, let me give Justin props, because most of the time when I've spoken about Justin Garson on this podcast and the things that he says on Twitter, they've been somewhat skeptical, critical, on the not nice side of things. So let me say this as clearly as humanly possible. I am super happy to hear, about this place called Inner Fire in Vermont. And I'm super happy to hear that there are alternative communities where people are receiving therapeutic services and responsive care that is helping. So there's the research problem, which is like, what exactly is unique about these communities, and is it actually scientifically different? Like, statistically speaking, is it statistically significantly different than outcomes in psych hospitals, rehabs, and things like that? That's a scientific question, an empirical question. But what I want to say is mental health is not an individual illness. So mental illnesses, schizophrenia, PTSD, depression, bipolar, personality disorders, all these conditions are not in the individual. Just so everyone's clear, dear consumers of therapy services, you are sick. However, your sickness is not completely located inside of you. So the reason I wanted to pair Nick Tabor's post about the fact that, school children or school age children in school are often pathologized by teachers, school counselors, school psychologists, therapists, etc., without much consideration for the type of environment, why families might be part of the problem, why the nature of the school setting is part of the problem, how schools are run is part of the problem, how schools are managed is part of the problem, the fact that kids have to sit all day when they're not designed to sit all day is part of the problem. Like, both of these posts share the same theme, which is it's time that we stopped blaming individuals for their mental illness. So, something that I think is going to be a huge change in the next, I'd say, 10 years. Maybe sooner than that, maybe longer than that. I don't know, but my current guess is 10 years. Is we're going to start understanding what the family systems theorists of the 1980s, like Mnuchin and all these people, figured out in the 80s, which is there's no person who gets sick alone, and there's no person who gets well alone. What that means is your mental illness might have to do with your genetics. It might have to do with your unique temperament and whatever happened to you in the womb and all these things. All these things are real forces that relate to the risk of developing a mental illness and the course of a mental illness and the onset and all of these things. So there are individual components and there is individual responsibility for your mental health, whatever the hell that actually means. That being said, you cannot just say because you are the sick person, you have the sole responsibility to get well. Because everything in life, everything related to the mind is contextual, because the mind is not located inside of you. Because all day, your brain is being bombarded by stimuli. All day, your brain is being bombarded by dozens of sights, some which you can consciously see, and some which you're unconsciously attending to, like light intensities and shadows and things like that. Dozens of sounds. Right now, you are currently hearing not just my voice if you're listening, but also whatever noise is in the room. If there's like an air conditioner going or a pet sleeping or outside traffic noise or whatever might be there, probably a dozen different things. But also your skin is taking in probably dozens and dozens of sensations. Like right now I'm wearing a shirt and a jacket and pants, or am I wearing pants? But I'm wearing all these things. And so I am wearing pants, by the way. So all these things that are causing pressure on the top 3 layers of my skin. I have temperature and pressure sensors in my skin, right? We all do. And so your brain is being bombarded all day and all night with dozens and dozens of sensations that it's making sense of and constructing and reacting to. Which means we're physically overwhelmed and psychologically overwhelmed all day. And our brain's very good at sifting. It's very good at paying attention to only a limited number of things, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 or 6 things at once. And we can really pay special attention to 1 or 2 things at once, usually just 1. But we're being bombarded by dozens and dozens of sensations every day. Worse, we're also bombarded by dozens and dozens of relationships, because all of us have, family and friends and coworkers, and some of us have spouses and romantic partners. And so we have all these relationships that live in our mind that affect us all day. Probably one of the most important variables for our mental health are our relationships, current and past. And so there are hundreds of things that affect how we feel and why we feel. And so it's important for everybody to understand that just because you have a diagnosis like major depressive disorder, and you do have responsibility for coping differently, for trying harder, for doing different things as an individual, you also have to realize that your environment, the people around you, your choices, the part that you're in control of is your choices to be in relationships with people. Your past choices to choose to be in relationships with people, those people affected you. Those people sometimes currently affect you. And so because of that, these people are part of your mental illness. Now, sometimes they're directly part of your mental illness because the common example is like intimate partner violence. So IPV is a real thing, and it's a tragedy because otherwise healthy and sane people are now in a dynamic that they sometimes feel stuck in, and they are stuck in because it's very difficult to relieve an intimate partner violence relationship. And so they have this real other person that is constantly harming them. And that is crippling or toxic or whatever word that makes the most sense to you. And so you can't tell me that just because you have a mental health symptom that you can like white knuckle it or bootstrap your way out of it. It's not that simple. There's a context. And so this specific context is IPV, intimate partner violence. But it isn't always that drastic. In fact, usually for people with mental illnesses, it's much more varied than just something as drastic and tragic as intimate partner violence. Because sometimes people with mental illnesses just have family members and friends and coworkers and romantic partners who just don't understand them. And not being understood is sometimes very shame-inducing for people, or sometimes just merely sadness-inducing. And it's unique to the person. But what I'm saying is that the context of the person is equally, if not more important than your so-called personal responsibility. And it varies from case to case. In some cases, your personal responsibility is the most important thing. Moron conservatives would like for you to believe that it's always up to you and everything that you do and blah, 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 blah. But here's a real fact. If you're born in the wrong zip code, you are screwed. Because if you're born into a genocide, that's not your fault. So if you're literally born into trauma, guess what's not your fault? That's a zip code problem. And that's not something you can do anything about. If you're an infant in the middle of a genocide, that's not anything you can do about. And you are screwed because of that. Now, there should be hope, hopefully. But in many cases, there's not, because the traumatic environment is beyond what a person can actually tolerate or even escape. Because you're an infant, right? You're born into a war, right? Think of all the kids that are being born in Gaza and Ukraine and all these places. That's not your fault. What if you're born into poverty? That's not your fault. That's going to screw up your central nervous system. We've got plenty of good data on that. What if you're born without one of your parents? There's all sorts of research on like single parents being, not able to provide the same amount of support usually. And that's not your fault as an infant, as a kid. So there's all these obvious like contextual variables that relate to the sensitivity or the proneness to develop mental illness. That is no one's fault. That is not your fault as the individual. Now, what are you responsible for as an adult with volition and agency and insight and intelligence? You're responsible for doing the best that you can given what you know and what circumstances and resources you have. You're responsible for trying to get better resources if it's possible, because in some cases it's absolutely possible. In fact, if you live in an industrialized, rich or democratic country, you probably have lots of access and opportunity to resources, free and otherwise. One of the great privileges of my life is being born in the United States in a middle-class family with the opportunity to use whatever skills I have and gifts and privileges and luck that I have to try and do more. That's a privilege. And so it's incumbent upon me to take advantage of the opportunities and the privileges that have been afforded to me through no work of my own. The work is me taking advantage of things and doing something with these things, right? But there are millions, if not billions, of people born into circumstances that have none of that luck, none of that privilege, no genetic luck, no family of origin luck, no resources materially or emotionally. And that's not their fault. And so they're definitely not getting the same equal meritocracy start as other people. And so it's extremely important to realize that people with mental illnesses are often in family systems that either don't understand them, cannot understand them, and whether it's don't understand or can't understand, currently that means that they can't get the support they need from that family, which means that their chances of recovery are limited compared to people that have actual support. The other problem is that if you're chronically severely mentally ill, society often doesn't know what to do with you. If you're floridly psychotic walking around downtown Los Angeles or Venice Beach or whatever it is, most people have written you off. And you're a stereotype, and that's it. And people don't believe in you as a person anymore. So that's another societal contextual variable that very few people, especially of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps type, don't take into consideration. And so it's very important to recognize that the more mentally ill a person is, the more the deck is stacked against them, even if they're rich. Being super rich or being super poor is equally toxic and problematic, usually. Rich has some more, circumstances that are beneficial, but it often comes with more toxicity and sick people and pressure in ways that being extremely poor also don't have. So I really want people to understand that mental illness is an individual phenomenon, but it's also reinforced by, maintained by, and stabilized by family circumstances, relationship circumstances, financial circumstances, and societal circumstances. Because if the circumstances were not there, if the context was not there, then it would be infinitely more treatable. And so that's why I'm so thankful for Justin's post and Nick Tabor's post. Because what's true is there are alternative communities to psychiatric hospitals, inpatient rehabs, Rehabistan, as I call it. Also, on the school side of it for kids, right? Because kids are the other group of people that are especially vulnerable and screwed over by adults all the time. Children are taken advantage of, institutionalized, stigmatized, belittled, demeaned, demoralized, just as much as mentally ill adults in psych hospitals, especially by supposedly compassionate or well-meaning people who are ed psychologists, school psychologists, clinical psychologists, testing psychologists. So both Nick's post and Justin's post speak to the exact same problem, which is when you don't have the correct contextual understanding or people are in an environment that sucks for their mental health, you're going to see more symptoms that look like mental illness. You take any person that doesn't have a mental illness and you shove them in a psych hospital, they're going to have reactions that look insane. Because I've worked in a psych hospital, and it was hard for me as a professional who had a key card and had access to leave. And it's hard for everybody. It's hard for everybody. And it's especially hard for patients. And rehabs and psych hospitals can worsen people's mental health. A lot of my patients in Rehabistan have told me that, when I was first starting out with my addiction career, I had some understanding of what addiction was and how to get high and all these things. But then I went to grad school. I went to rehab and I learned a bunch of new ways to lie. I learned a bunch of new ways to manipulate. I learned a bunch of new things about drugs and ways to get high and all these things. And I became an expert. And that happens in rehabs, by the way. People who are moderately ill can go to a rehab and get worse, even in good rehabs. It happens, unfortunately, because you're in an environment that keeps you sick and keeps you around especially sick people. So when I think about Justin Garson's post, I want every consumer of mental health services to understand that you, the individual, have responsibility for improving your mental health. And, and your environment matters too. The people you associate with, the people you choose to affiliate with, impact your mental health, can make it easier or harder to get well. There are alternatives to psych hospitals, and I'm glad Justin's talking about what's called Inner Fire in Vermont. I'm super happy to hear that. Likewise, there's an analogous type of service, and so there are these farms for adults and young autistic individuals, especially folks who have a more limited IQ south of 70 typically. So if you're very intellectually disabled and very severely impaired because of autism spectrum, sometimes there are these alternative living situations as opposed to like a group home or a hospital or living with your family who often has a hard time helping you and taking care of you. There are these farms, literal farms, where persons on the severely impaired end of the autism spectrum can go live, learn very, very basic social skills, if that, and learn very, very rudimentary life skills, like taking care of your bodily hygiene, maybe growing a plant like carrots or something, and learning to minimally interact with people in a safe, caring environment. It's a very peaceful place because it's a farm out in the middle of nowhere, right? And so there are alternative communities to get well if you have a serious mental health problem, including Inner Fire in Vermont and these autistic farms that I'm talking about. And so people need to understand that although you are personally responsible for putting in the work to get better, you are also personally responsible for being clear about the type of environment you're choosing to be in. So just to give an example, I had a patient that I saw earlier today who is in a performing arts community that's very competitive and very toxic, to use the word that he used. And he's absolutely correct. He wasn't just being dramatic or something. He's correct that the type of environment he's in is extremely toxic and competitive. You know, so if you just think about the prototypes of environments in art that are competitive and toxic, it's like the top three are probably like a Juilliard kind of school, or like a ballet theater company, or ballet company, or like a theater company. I think of like Juilliard as a prototype that's toxic and competitive, or a ballet company, dance company, or like a theater company, like a Broadway company, right? Toxic, competitive, etc. And so he's in one of those, and he was telling me about his experiences of absolutely loving what he does for a living, but being very worried and conflicted because of the dynamics of where he's in this, you know, artistic community and his job. And he was saying that he's very clear that he is voluntarily signing up for a very toxic environment. And so our conversation today was about the trade-offs, that you're willing to make this trade-off, knowing that it's going to have these crystal clear consequences for your mental health that ended you up on a session with me, basically. And so that's very difficult for people, by the way. Something that I want everyone to understand, whether you're a clinician or whether you're a family member of someone with a mental illness, or whether you're a person with a mental illness seeking out therapy services or who needs therapy services or meds or whatever it is, whether you're a loved one, a consumer, or a professional, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Life is very messy and very complicated. It's very unloving to oversimplify people's very difficult circumstances, because people's very difficult context is more than just some childhood trauma stuff or attachment stuff. It's like, yes, you can have some really distorted internal working models of attachment. Yes, you can be traumatized. Yes, you can have a personality disorder. Those are all real things that exist. And it's not but, it's and. And people will unwittingly, because they're more naive or immature or whatever, put themselves in circumstances that they don't fully appreciate. And they only fully appreciate them once they're actually in them and they're struggling in them. And they'll feel stuck in those circumstances because it made sense to them at the time to get into that toxic romantic relationship, or in the case of my patient this morning, this toxic work environment. Because he loves what he does. And loving what you do sometimes comes with the trade-off of being in a very sick place. Because some of my friends, for instance, work in the fire department, and some of my friends work in the ER. And those are extremely toxic and traumatic environments. But they love being there. For what reason, I can't personally grasp. But they're there for a reason. Maladaptive or adaptive or both. And there's a trade-off, which is I do this thing that is existentially or personally fulfilling with the knowingness that it's going to have a consequence to me. And because all relationships involve trade-offs, all careers involve trade-offs, all friendships, all families, all romantic relationships, everything that we do involves trade-offs. Trade-offs we understand acutely and trade-offs we don't fully understand. And so because of that, if you're a patient or a family member or even a professional, you need to understand that people that are mentally ill are not merely mentally ill because of themselves. And that getting better is not just you need to cope better. You need to correct your false core negative beliefs. It's not that simple. They also have to have a different relationship with their environment. Because if you're in a toxic environment like that patient I told you about earlier, it's going to be very difficult to actually get better. Right? If you're a firefighter, for instance, and you're constantly going into fires or constantly responding to emergencies, and you constantly see people dying and mangled and burned to death, or whatever it is, no human being is designed to be around trauma all the time. Just no one is. It's going to have consequences. And so it's impossible to be perfectly mentally healthy, whatever that actually means, if you continue to participate in an environment, in a relationship, in a job that's maintaining your illness. And so there's different options for people, by the way. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to this problem I'm describing of context and environment. Sometimes you can bolster resources to make this toxic environment more manageable and tolerable. Sometimes you can go talk to that toxic boss and have a confrontational, loving but confrontational relationship with him, and it might move the dial somewhat. Sometimes you have to leave. Sometimes. Not all the time, sometimes. Sometimes you need to enlist more social support. There are various things that we can do. Sometimes if we just understand why we chose that toxic environment, that toxic relationship, why we believe we deserve to suffer, right? There are a great many people who come to Therapyland, the world's worst theme park, that genuinely believe they deserve to suffer. They have pathological guilt or shame, and they believe they deserve to suffer. And because they believe they deserve to suffer, they unconsciously choose romantic relationships, friendships that take advantage of them, that don't love them, that hurt them. And they can't see that. And they have to learn how to see that. And then they have to learn how to act differently in those relationships. And sometimes the relationship improves. And sometimes those relationships have to go away. But it's not just you have to recognize that you're mentally ill and do everything in your power to not be mentally ill. And that's the end of the story. No, if your environment's super toxic, you're fucked. It's that simple, right? It's true for psychological distress. It's true for biological distress. Like, think of like Flint, Michigan or whatever, where there's like literal lead in the water. If you're constantly drinking a poisonous substance that you think is good for you, and you don't change that behavior, the poison is going to harm you. And that's not rocket science. However, for some reason, when it comes to mental illness, there's this like fundamental attribution error that it's your fault, you should do something about it. I promise you all that the person, the clinician, the mental health provider that can adequately address the fact that it's both a you problem and an environment problem, to whatever degree it's both, is a really good therapist. A psychiatrist that understands that there's a complicated relationship between your mind, your body, and your environment can actually help you, is a good, competent clinician. So if you're looking for a therapist right now, if you're looking for a psychiatrist, one of the questions you could ask them is, how do you understand the impact of relationships, family, society, physical health, and my mental health problem? And if they can't give you a good, reasonable answer to that question, that's probably not the therapist for you. It's probably a charlatan. It's probably a hack. Dr. Rollergator says, why did they make the poison so delicious then? You know, some poisons taste great. So for instance, a lot of people enjoy alcohol. And alcohol is literally a poison, by the way. But some alcohol tastes great. You mix a little Red Bull with some vodka, margarita, whatever it is, and it's the tastiest poison on the planet. And so what I would argue is that a lot of people engage in poisonous, toxic things because they believe there's some upside. And that's not weird. That's not even a sign of mental illness. Think about all the regular person ways that people engage in toxic things that are bad for them. Like social media. Social media is often pretty toxic. Many corners of the internet are very, very toxic. Now, I have gone to great pains to make my Twitter as non-toxic as possible. I have muted everything political. I've muted everything culture war. And now I have like bunnies and fitness and cats. And that's about it. And it's great. And it's like some therapy Twitter stuff too. And so like, you have the power to make your online life less toxic. Everybody does. Everybody does. Phil Bradley says, I ruined my liver trying to heal my heart. I'm very sorry to hear that, Phil. Very, very sorry. I hope that whatever happened, you can recover from it, because that's very sad, you know? So genuinely speaking, I hope for everyone's sake they understand what I'm trying to say, that environment and context of your mental health problem is equally as important, if not more important, than your so-called personal responsibility in many cases. Now, for some patients, taking more personal responsibility is the first step. That's the most important thing you can do. But for some people genuinely do not recognize the full depth and breadth of the way their very sick relationships, sick family members, sick habits at work, whatever, are impacting their mental health. So I genuinely hope everyone gets that it's complicated. But if you ignore the environment, if you do not choose a better environment, you're going to stay a certain amount of sick. And so we do have it, especially if you live in a well-resourced environment. Like if you live in the United States, you have access to lots of resources. Medically, financially, socially, job, friend, religion, school, sex, all those things. You have access to so many resources. And all we have to do is we have to take more advantage of those resources in these very like lucky, privileged experiences we have here. So I hope this makes sense to everyone. It's really good to be back. I'm kind of at the end of my time here. I'm curious if there's any final thoughts or chats. There's a couple of people who've chatted. Thank you for coming out today and chatting and saying stuff and hanging out. Dr. Rollergator and Phil, thanks for being here. Appreciate you. Anything else that you'd like to contribute before we part ways? Because today was kind of a light day with only a couple of topics. Next week, I will have so much more to say. But it looks like that is it for today. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all for watching and listening and being part of the podcast today. I am Dr. Patrick Lockwood. For the purpose of this podcast, please think of me as Patrick. Don't sue me, etc., etc. This is UnShrink Me, and UnShrink Me is a weekly podcast dedicated specifically to educate the community, inform consumers about what is and what is not true about mental health, so on and so forth, so that you get the best possible care, you get the most out of your mental health services provider, etc. So that's the spirit of this podcast. If you found something that I said today helpful, interesting, curiosity-inducing, inspiring, funny, please share with people that might need to hear it. Please like and subscribe and all these things. Please comment after the fact. I'd love to hear what you think and speak about it on the next podcast if possible. And, as always, I like to end the podcast with a joke of some kind because I think humor is essential for whatever mental health actually is. And so without further delay, here is today's joke. So once upon a time, I worked with this patient, this young man in his 30s, and this dude had a lot of anger. And, his anger was kind of confusing to me because a lot of people have anger because they're traumatized. A lot of people have anger because they're resentful, whatever it was. But his was kind of like out of proportion to the circumstances. And I don't know, I couldn't really tell. I'd only worked with him for a few sessions. So this guy had all this anger, and he was married and he had a kid and all these things. And he was very, very sad that his anger blow-ups at home, yelling and things like that, were affecting his kid and affecting his wife. And so we worked for a while. He seemed to have some depression, a little bit of trauma as a kid. But it wasn't crystal clear that the depression was the cause of the anger or that the trauma was. And sometimes, thinking about causes isn't the most helpful thing to actually start moving the needle. And sometimes, just so everyone knows out there, sometimes life circumstances and happenstance actually shows up and makes it easier to recover and get well. And so this was one of those cases where random chance actually helped this guy with his anger. And so I've been working with him for 4 or 5 sessions, and he came back after another blow up and said, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. I don't think my wife is going to stay with me. I feel bad about what I'm doing to my kid, all these things. And I said, okay, what can we try? And so we stopped looking for causal things and started talking more about his coping skills. And so, he was an avid reader. So we talked about, can he go read when he starts to feel frustrated? We talked about the usual kind of anger management things like pause. Definitely you should go pause whenever you're feeling angry, or walk away if it's bad enough anger. You can do some deep breaths, 10 deep breaths. So there's all these standard things that you teach people. And, he had a really hard time applying these things. And so we met for a couple of more weeks, and he kind of struggled to apply these coping skills, as many people with, pathological anger do. And so anyways, he came back a couple of weeks later after continued attempts to try and help him feel understood and to practice the coping skills, encouragement, and all these things. And he came back a couple of weeks later and he said, Doc, I feel kind of stupid. I'm like, why do you feel stupid? Help me understand what's going on. He's like, well, my wife got a cat. I'm like, okay, tell me about the cat. And he's like, well, this cat is in such and such type of cat, and it was really great, and it's very cuddly and all these things. And he's like, the cat does this weird thing. Every time I start to get upset, the cat walks up to me and starts meowing and like rubbing on my leg. And I just kind of can't help but like go down there and start petting the cat, and I'm automatically distracted. And I like stop yelling. And like for the last week, I only yelled one time, which is a miracle for him. And now like every time I pet the cat, I immediately calm down, and I think it's gonna work. I think I'm gonna stop yelling. I said, okay, let's see if your cat hypothesis is correct. And so we didn't even talk about other coping skills or whatever. I said, go, if you think this is going to work, let's go do it and give it a try. And let's run the experiment, because I'm all about running experiments. And so met a week later, and he said, Doc, I didn't yell one time this week. And it's just every time I started to get frustrated and like raise my voice a little bit, the cat walked up to me, and we start rubbing the cat, and I felt better. And I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm like soothing myself. I don't know. I'm like, Well, it sounds like you're having a real catharsis. All right. Thanks all for being here. See you next week. Take good care of yourselves. Eat good food. Get good sleep. Have good sex. Be good to each other. I will see you soon. Goodbye. Good luck.